So I want to take some time to talk about Marianne Williamson's appearance on MSNBC. She did a phenomenal job. She basically said everything that I would have said if I had the opportunity to talk to MSNBC's audience. And I know what you're thinking. If you're watching this channel and you're a leftist, you already know that MSNBC is trash, right? They're basically the propaganda arm of the Democratic Party in the same way that Fox News is the propaganda wing of the Republican Party. But still, this channel is important because they are trusted with the Democratic Party's base. Normie Democrats love MSNBC, and they take what MSNBC hosts say as gospel, essentially. So if we could get through to them and get them to at least start to think a little bit more critically about the Democratic Party establishment and so-called moderate Democrats, then perhaps they start to warm up to the idea of supporting more progressive candidates in presidential primaries. And we don't just get our clocks cleaned because MSNBC says Bernie bad or the next progressive bad in upcoming presidential primaries and primary races across the country, more specifically. So Marianne Williamson explains exactly why Biden is failing. And MSNBC Democrats, they know that, there's all these excuses. Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema, the parliamentarian. So they might instinctively want to cleanse Biden of any culpability whatsoever. But what Marianne Williamson is forcing them to do is to think more critically. There's a number of things that Biden can do unilaterally via executive order just with his pen, but he's not doing it. And that's because he doesn't care, and he's also corrupt. So Marianne Williamson makes a very strong case as to why Biden is a failure. And this is really important because, again, remember who she's talking to. She's talking to MSNBC's audience, which is just overall unapologetically loyal to the Democratic Party. This is really an important message that they desperately needed to hear. Let's watch.
Marianne Williamson joins me now. Marianne, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your time. Just last month, you endorsed a progressive primary challenger to longtime Democratic Colorado Congresswoman there. And when Politico raised the subject of you possibly challenging Joe Biden in the 2024 Democratic primary, you declined to comment. You clearly have issues with the Democratic establishment. Tell me a little bit about what role you are looking to play politically.
Well, the role I most want to play politically right now is citizen. And as a citizen of this country, obviously, I'm very concerned about the 2020 elections because, as you said, the president's agenda is not succeeding in high approval ratings and getting him high approval ratings. It is not doing the kinds of things for the American people, which could legitimately be believed to make people want to stand in line for 7 or 8 hours as they did before. The president came into office with promises to help people, promises to lift them out of their misery. And that wasn't just a promise if Congress will allow me to do it. So I think that the promises to fulfill the will of the American people and to help the American people can still be accomplished even without congressional approval of such things as the Voting Rights Act or such things as Build Back Better, if the president will use the power of executive orders. He could eradicate that college loan debt today. He could get 36 million people. If he would just take $50,000 out of each one of those loan debts, 36 million people would be unshackled from those debts. They could start businesses. They could own homes. He could use a national medical emergency to basically give Medicare to every single person in America. He could do that tonight. He could declassify marijuana from a Schedule I drug. Right now, I'm just a citizen who wants, as any Democrat does, and I think any reasonable person wants, to forestall the kind of red wave that could be coming at us in 2022. Because remember, it's not just about a Republican win. It's about what kinds of Republicans stand to win. And we have 435 Democrats who are running for the House. We have 34 Senate races going on in 2022. Those candidates need to be able to say to their constituents, the Democrats will help you. And right now, the Democrats are not helping people the way we need to.
You never hear that on mainstream media, and that is so important because for the very first time, an MSNBC viewer who never actually thought about the Democratic Party and the way that they're failing might be thinking, wait a second, that's kind of a good point. I didn't know that Biden can simply cancel all student debt via executive order. And so why isn't he doing that? I have a child that went to college and is strapped with student debt that I didn't have to pay when I went to college. Why isn't he doing that? That's really interesting. Wait a second. He can actually give everyone healthcare in America, but he's not doing that? Why isn't he doing this? It's just really a matter of planting the seeds, which doesn't get done on MSNBC to the extent that they allow left-wing political commentators on the network, such as Sam Seder. I mean, it's pretty rare. So when we see, Marianne Williamson go on MSNBC, David Sirota, Sam Seder, I think that that's really important. These are valuable appearances that help to, for lack of a better word, radicalize MSNBC's normie audience. Now, everything that Marianne Williamson is saying is absolutely correct. We've talked about how he can cancel student debt on his own, but a lot of people don't even know that Joe Biden actually can give everyone in America Medicare for all because of the Affordable Care Act and a specific provision within that legislation. Now, it's a little bit complicated, and this legal maneuver would unquestionably be challenged by the courts. The pharmaceutical industry, the health industry wouldn't allow this to stand. But still, if Joe Biden cared, it's at least worthwhile to put up this fight, but he won't even do that. So if you don't know, let's actually talk about this. So this is in the American Prospect, written back in November of 2020 by David Dayen, and he explains, the people of Libby, Montana, population 2,628, share something in common with the rest of the developed world, but not their compatriots in the United States. They all have access to a single-payer Medicare for all system. As part of the Affordable Care Act, residents of Libby who were exposed to hazardous airborne asbestos from a vermiculite mine owned by the W.R. Grace Company were made eligible for Medicare for free at the discretion of the Social Security Administration and the Department of Health and Human Services. It was codified in Section 1881A of the Social Security Act. The language of the statute refers to any individual subject to an environmental exposure, though it was well understood at the time that this was about Libby. There's an environmental health hazard spreading through the entire country right now. It's infecting people unsuspectingly and killing hundreds of thousands. It's bound to saddle those who survive with long-term and potentially debilitating health consequences. The incoming Biden administration can give all 11 million people infected with COVID, and if they really want to be aggressive, all Americans who have tested positive for coronavirus the option of free Medicare coverage immediately. The primary pilot program in Section 1881A is the Libby, Montana program, but the executive branch is also given the authority to establish optional pilot programs to any area subject to a public health emergency declaration. The entire United States has been under a public health emergency since January 31st of 2020 due to the coronavirus. It's possible that the Environmental Protection Agency would have to declare a separate public health emergency under the Superfund law to comply with the statute, but Biden's EPA administrator could easily do so. Individuals eligible for Medicare would have to have spent 6 months in the geographic area subject to the emergency. Since the area is the entire United States, this should not be a problem either. So there's more to it, but in essence, that's the crux of the legal reasoning. Now, again, this is going to get challenged if Biden were to ever do something like this, and he wouldn't. But if you actually care about Americans who are suffering, who don't have healthcare, it's worth the fight. But the point is that Marianne Williamson is talking about the possibilities, things that Biden can do, because then that plants the question in the brains of MSNBC viewers, wait, he can do this, but he won't. Why? Why won't he do this? This is really, really important because MSNBC's audience, Democratic Party's most loyal base, they're conditioned to unequivocally accept any and everything that the Democratic Party says and does because the alternative is so awful, the Republican Party, and they are crazy. But that's why Marianne Williamson also makes the point that if you want to stop Republicans from winning, you have to relieve people's pain, because they're not going to come out and stand in line for hours at a time if they don't feel as if Democrats are delivering. It's just too high of a cost for not a big enough payoff. So this is very important because what Marianne Williamson is saying is correct, and she's not going to get through to 100% of MSNBC's audience, but perhaps 10% just think for the first time, you know what, that's right. Maybe I should expect more from Democrats. Maybe I should opt for more left-wing Democrats, since time after time, moderate Democrats have failed us. After a Democratic Party administration, we get a more radical and extreme version of the Republican Party, and maybe their failures is feeding into the radicalization because people are desperate and they're looking for answers and they're susceptible to being radicalized by a demagogue like Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis or some other dickhead. So this is really invaluable, what Marianne Williamson is saying here. Now, one more clip that I want to show you is her calling out Biden for being weak. This was incredible. Just right off the bat, she tells Democrats, stop being wusses. And I love this so much. I can't even tell you, but let's watch.
So I wanted to get to a few more points really quickly before we run out of time, but you've also argued that Democrats like Joe Biden are missing their moment because they're too scared of being tarred as socialists. And you write that, like Biden, FDR got called a socialist and a destroyer of capitalism and heard all the same things they say about progressives today. The difference, however, Roosevelt didn't care. How would you advise Democrats to break that cycle today?
Oh, please, don't be wusses. You know what Roosevelt said? I welcome their hatred. That's what he said. You know, Trump was a strongman. He was a political strongman. He abused power. That we do not want. But neither do we need a weak president right now. We need someone as strong as Roosevelt. And it's obviously apparently not enough to just have his picture up in the Oval Office. Roosevelt would be acting. Roosevelt would be taking what he called the drastic measures necessary to relieve people of despair and chronic tension and anxiety in terms of their health care, in terms of the economy that is building up into an unsustainable rage. And if the Democrats do not respond to this, we will see dark days ahead.
She's exactly right. See, the problem with the Democratic Party is that there's just no spark. There's no sign of life, even right now in the White House. Biden has, how many months? 10 months until the midterms. He can do so much to try to relieve people's suffering just with executive order. He can call on Congress to send him bills, even if he knows that it's not going to get through Manchin and Sinema. He can at least put up the appearance that he cares, that he's willing to fight, but he won't even do the bare minimum. He won't even do political theater. And so this is a failure on his part. They're weak. They're wussies. And now, as she said, we don't need an authoritarian strongman like Donald Trump, but we need someone who is going to vociferously advocate for what the American people needs. And what Democrats in Congress don't understand is that right now we have a limited window of time to act. And when I say we, really, I mean them, elected Democrats. You have to do voting rights reform to stop a coup from Republicans. You have to try to ameliorate some of the suffering from Americans if you want them to turn out to vote. Republicans are explicitly authoritarian at this point. They're against democracy, and you don't have much room to govern if we lose more of our democracy. It's already hanging on by a thread. So at a minimum, you've got to at least try. You might fail, but just showing us that you want to fight is important in and of itself. But what Marianne Williamson is saying is that Democrats don't want to do that. Either they just are uninterested in governing, or they're too scared. Now, FDR, he did say, I welcome their hatred. He was talking to corporate America, talking to Wall Street. And imagine a modern day Democrat doing that. It's just inconceivable. And the reason why this is the case, cynical take here, is because the Democratic Party doesn't actually want to govern. They like when the Republican Party shifts further and further to the right because they're hoping to pick up these moderates that the Republican Party, in theory, is losing as they shift further to the right to appease their more fringe base. But the problem is that moderates aren't going to the Democratic Party. They're shifting to the right with the Republican Party. And as Democrats try to desperately court these moderates that they think Republicans are losing, they're losing their own base. They're losing young people. They're losing the left. But you see, it's a value proposition to Democrats. If you had the choice to have moderates in your base or the left in your base, and you're sold out, you're completely beholden to corporate interests and Wall Street, who do you prefer? Well, of course, moderates. Because with moderates, there's no expectation there for you to deliver. You can do tax cuts for the rich. You can try to further privatize Medicare and Social Security, and they're not going to complain. But the left is going to have an expectation. So the best thing that these corporate Democrats can do and hope for is to just bring in as many moderates as possible and push out the left. When they say they're a Big Tent party, they don't mean that includes you. That means that they include Republicans. That's the subtext. So, either way, the Democratic Party is in very bad shape, and what Marianne Williamson is giving them is common sense advice. Now, Democrats who watch this, who are elected officials, they're not going to care. But what really is important is that MSNBC's audience listens to what Marianne Williamson has to say. And if some of them are receptive to her message, then that just is, the small spark that might ignite the fire and make them realize the Democratic Party sucks. We need to opt for someone who's actually a left-winger and not these milquetoast moderates who continue to fail time and again.
Man.